Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. My name is Councillor Katie Lomas. I'm chairing the meeting this evening. With us here in the room, you will see around this slightly smaller than usual table. We have our monitoring officer, Bryn Roberts, on one side, and our democracy officer, Robert Flintoft, on the other side, and then members of the committee on either side as we go down, and our speakers, when they join us through the evening, will be seated at the end of the table. So we just have one item on the agenda apart from the minutes this evening. Can I first start by asking for any declarations of interest? Apologies, thank you. We have had apologies this evening, which I forgot about, from Councillor Musson, and Councillor Fitzpatrick is substituting for her. Thank you, Councillor Fitzpatrick, for doing that. So move now on to declarations of interest. Do you have any members have any declarations of interest that are not on their register of interests? No. In that case, move on to the minutes of the last meeting held on the 18th of January 2023. And before we look at those, I have had a comment sent to me from a member of the public asking if in future, if we reorder the agenda for any reason, which we have done once or twice in the past to make it more sensible for speakers, can we reorder the minutes and note in the minutes that the agenda was reordered, which I think is very reasonable and will be helpful in future for us to follow through the minutes. Anything else on those minutes that anyone wants to raise? No? Everyone happy for me to sign those minutes? Marvellous, thank you very much. Now we move on to public participation. We have 4 public speakers this evening. The first member of the public to speak is Councillor Waters. Councillor Waters, I know you know the drill. You have 3 minutes to address the committee. I will try and give you a helpful indication at about 30 seconds to go.
Thank you, Chair. Taken together with your previous meeting's review of the member training programme, this LGA report is just twaddle. It's designed to hide as best as possible beneath LGA verbiage the latest disgraceful episode at York Council. I didn't really expect anything else by the LGA after their previous inept investigation into procurement issues at the February 2017 Audit and Governance meeting.
Councillor Waters.
The 2021.
Councillor Waters, can we ask that you keep your comments to matters that you want to address us on and not criticising our colleagues from the LGA who have been helpful in supporting us through this?
So we're not allowed to pass comment on this LGA report?
I would be very interested to hear any and all comments you have on the report, but I think you need to be mindful that you're not passing comment on any of our colleagues from the LGA who've been helpful in working with us on our response to the PIR. So please do talk about the report, not the people.
All I've talked about to press is the LGA report. The 2021 Public Interest Report was not issued due to a widespread outbreak of inappropriate member conduct. It was not issued to deal with poor member officer protocols across the council, and it was certainly not issued to deal with the majority of members not knowing what were prejudicial interests at meetings. The 2021 Public Interest Report was issued in response to the council leader refusing to work with the former chief executive straight after the 2019 election. The subsequent allegations of bullying and victimisation found their way into an industrial tribunal case, and to make the case go away, the former chief executive was paid off after decisions taken at Staffing Matters and Urgency on the 17th of February. Everything seems to happen in February here. A meeting unbelievably chaired by the council leader. The payoff exceeded contractual obligations, and Mazars, the external auditor, commented, "The amount paid has not been properly approved and is arguably an unlawful payment." Mazars further commented, "A local authority should not enter a settlement arrangement simply to avoid embarrassment to the authority or individual elected members. The wider elected membership of this council had no responsibility for the disgraceful actions of the council leader in bringing the 2021 public interest report crashing down on the council. The LGA report talks of trust, behaviour, leadership, etc. The fact that the member who caused the whole situation remains in post as leader renders the report and actions, as I said earlier, twaddle. It particularly amuses me to see the second recommendation in paragraph 4.5 of the LGA report as to cross-party working. Therefore, it's interesting and opportune to note in a just issued public interest report into Cheshire East the following statement. Perhaps the most significant cultural reset for the council in its relationship between officers and members is the move to a committee system. Of course, that's what should have happened here. But the self-interest and self-preservation of certain individuals in the executive elected dictator model ensured that that Lib Dem manifesto pledge of 2019 is as worthless as no doubt this year's will be. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Waters. Your comments will, of course, be taken into account by members when they consider the report later. Our next public speaker is Gwen Swinburne.
Thank you, Chair. I'm shocked at both, we're still on, sorry. I'm shocked at both the LGA report and the monitoring officer's report. It defies belief that between them, they have transformed a massive series of mistakes, poor judgments, and worse by each of the statutory officers and the then head of HR and Councillor Aspen into a full-scale attack on all members. Let's be clear, these officers and the leader colluded to get rid of the chief executive in such a hand-fisted way that it has cost us nearer 1.5 million, a public interest report, and the imposition of the current chief operating officer. We see management actions are becoming increasingly Kafkaesque, where elected members are treated like children, told who they may talk to, on what phone, always subservient to the never wrong, ever watching, omnipotent, they who must be obeyed officers. Councillor Aspen, now almost invisible, has successfully eluded every form of censure, including proper processes at the Standards Committee, aided by the then conflicted monitoring officer. Trust and confidence in him has to be gone. The former monitoring officer also escaped a misconduct in public office prosecution after nearly 2 years investigation, as it apparently didn't meet the criminal bar. Regarding members, but not officers, being inducted on the member officer code, it seems that officers need such training. I wonder, for example, what induction the recently arrived monitoring officer has been through. After all, York is very different from North Tyneside. Members, you must protect yourselves. If you ever want monitoring officer advice on your interests, ask for it in writing and require a written response. Be prepared to publish it. We can't have this he said, she said again. Regarding your register of interests and those missing of the chief officers, the 2016 public interest report agreed an annual update. But like a number of actions from that PIR, it has been ignored. The monitoring officer has not even updated your form from last May. You are supposed to declare on £25, not 50. Members, you are being unfairly vilified here. We all know the idiom about fish rotting from the head. whether it's management or political parties, the latest problem started from the 2011 administration. Just look at the leadership of the political parties and the administration. We need a change of all of them urgently. Another sad day for democracy in York. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure that members will take your comments into account when they're considering the report later.
Thank you, Chair.
Our next speaker is Councillor Douglas.
Thanks, Chair. This meeting is considering the final report of the Local Government Association, looking into actions that were required of the City of York Council following the Liberal Democrat Council leader, Councillor Keith Aston's involvement in decision-making that led to a potentially unlawful payment to the Chief Executive, Mary Weastel. It resulted in a nationally rare public interest report in April 2021. Ms Weastel lodged an employment tribunal against the council, and Councillor Aston was personally named in the paperwork she submitted. A financial gift in accounting terms was lodged in the council's accounts and unearthed by Mazars, the external auditors. This was an additional, non-statutory, potentially unlawful payment, a payment seemingly to secure Ms Weastel's silence. The impact of this whole sorry affair has been a loss of trust in the leadership of our council and a hefty total bill that approaches £500,000. £500,000 of York Council taxpayers' money at a time when council budgets are stretched to the limit and services are crumbling under the weight of increasing demand and shrinking real-term funding. The whole sorry tale is totally dismaying and a blight on the reputation of our fantastic city. The LGA assurance team asks of the council's actions so far, so what? Has the culture of the council really changed since 2021 and that damning public interest report? They tell us what is less clear is whether the culture is changing enough. There is only small evidence of change. Unfortunately, I agree. A recent example of this lack of culture change was raised when the council leader, Councillor Aston, point blank excluded opposition party councillors across the chamber from participating in the development of the vitally important 10-year strategy for York. How does this serve the people of York and their aspirations? It just doesn't. The local elections are coming up on the 4th of May 2023, and the people of York across our communities will have a chance to tell us what they think to all of this. I am the leader of the opposition Labour councillors, and should York vote for change, for a Labour-run council, I will potentially be the first female leader of the council for 40 years. Democracy in York under Labour and my leadership will look very different. We'll operate a transparent and collaborative council, making decisions in the best interest of our whole city. The people and organisations of our city are telling me they are ready for change, and I have to agree with them. It can't come soon enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Douglas. I'm certain that your comments will be taken into account when we consider the report later in the meeting. Our final public speaker this evening is Joe Coles. Joe, you're very welcome. You have 3 minutes to address the committee, and I will attempt to give you as discreet a 30-second warning as I can so that it doesn't interrupt what you're saying.
Thank you, and apologies for being a few minutes late. As a local resident, I have some observations and some questions about this payment. Parents across the city are struggling to feed their children. Food banks in our city are overwhelmed with demand, so I just cannot understand how this payment can have been made. Surely, when budgets are tight and people's bills are rising, the priority should be local services. In the 21st century, our city has the scandal of children being admitted to hospital with hypothermia. This surely should be the council's focus. It currently costs £450 a year to provide a child with a school dinner. The money that's been spent here could probably have provided all the children in a couple of primary schools in the city with a free dinner for an entire year. Wouldn't the money have been better spent helping families deal with the cost of living crisis? And what about the 283 children in the care of City of York Council? The money that's been spent here could have provided the children could have helped those families and those children with mental health support. It could have helped their foster carers. What about some of the youth provision in areas of the city where we are sorely lacking that at the moment? Couldn't some of that money been used on our young people? The list could go on and on. Seeing this as the strategic leadership of the council reflects very badly on our city. It is letting council taxpayers down who themselves are struggling with the cost of living. And it leaves me wondering whose side the council are really on, because it doesn't feel like it's the residents. It feels totally dysfunctional. And if it really is a reflection of the City of York Council's culture and priorities, it's a disgrace for council taxpayers.
Thank you very much, Jo, and I'm certain that your comments will be taken into account when we consider the report later in the meeting. Thank you to all our public speakers. You're very welcome to stay and watch the rest of the meeting here, or if you prefer, you're also welcome to leave and find somewhere perhaps slightly more comfortable to watch it on the streaming. But we'll move now to the main item on our agenda, which is the report of the Local Government Association into the PIR. I'm delighted that we have Mark Edgell with us this evening. Mark, do you want to come and join us at the table? You are very welcome. I'm going to give you the opportunity to open and introduce your report.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, thanks very much to City of York Council for inviting or asking the LGA to have a look at your public interest report. And the council agreed the terms of reference for our piece of work, which was very much about looking at the 5 recommendations from Mazars and how the council responded to that. We stretched the recommendations, I have to say, to go on to look at some other issues as well, but that was agreed by the City Council, and we've talked about that, I think, in 1.2, where Mazars within the public interest report talk about some longer term issues, recurring issues around conflicts of interest and standards of member behaviour that have led to audit action on media coverage in recent years. We refer to those around as being about behaviours and about culture. So a lot of this report focuses more on the so what question and those cultural questions rather than the narrow issue of those 5 recommendations. So as I said, the council agreed the recommendations, so we did the work that the council asked us to do. The work was carried out by myself and an HR expert and also an experienced monitoring officer from another local authority as well. So we had that expertise to look at it through those different lenses, through an HR lens, through a monitoring officer lens, and also from my own sort of general lens as well. And I think our view was the council has done well to respond so quickly and thoroughly to the narrow issue of those 5 recommendations. And that's what we say within this report. There was a lot of activity undertaken, a lot of actions undertaken, a lot of focus, I think, around looking at a changed code of conduct, looking at changing the constitution, making sure people were trained within those new pieces of paper. But I think our main focus, as I said, on this report, and indeed in our thoughts, was really about that so what question, that third question as I have on 1.43. You've done all these sorts of things, so what actual difference has it made in terms of the outcomes you're looking for? Because I assume whenever somebody does something, they're expecting a result from that or hoping for a result from that. So we'd hope the City Council was thinking about the outcome they're looking for by changing the code of conduct and training people on it, and by changing the constitution and training people on it. So to what extent have those changes actually happened, but also what impact have they had on these sort of wider questions that Mazars talk about around culture or not. So our recommendations around that are really focused around those longer term and those cultural issues. And I think if you read our report with an open mind as either a member of this authority or a senior officer in this authority, I think you'd be pretty worried about what we say in terms of some of those ongoing issues, and that we're not convinced that some of the actions you put in place have so far had an impact on those cultural issues and may not in the future. So I think there is a question for the City Council about what the culture of the organisation looks moving forward. And that is around, whether officers are doing the job that they need to do to advise members, whether officers are being allowed to do the job they need to do to advise members, whether members are listening to that sort of advice. We have particularly picked up on some stuff around some members have been complaining about officers, which we just find absolutely bizarre and a real red flag in terms of a culture of an organisation where members feel they should or can complain about officers. That doesn't mean officers are absolutely perfect in this organisation, but if we've got to the stage where members are complaining about officers, and it says there's something seriously wrong with the organisation. There's also a point, I think, that some of those sorts of complaints are around decisions that the council have made around certain policies or procedures or the outcomes of some of those decisions that the council have made. Now, most of the decisions in this authority are made through the executive model, in other words, made by portfolio holders or by the executive. So I think if other members of the authority have a problem with some of the decisions that have been made or the outcome of those decisions, they have the route through call-in, or they have the route through overview and scrutiny to challenge those decisions, or they can just talk directly to the portfolio holder or the collective executive about the decision that's been made and what's coming out of that. I think officers in any authority, can be criticised, but they don't really have the right to reply to those sorts of things. So I think members should be challenging the right people about decisions that have been made within the authority. But there are some wider recommendations there, which I won't go through right now, but there is a need for all members to behave in line with the code of conduct. Now, that is not saying that every member currently doesn't. It may be saying, that there are pockets of members or individual members that aren't currently behaving in line with the code of conduct, but it requires every single member to behave in line with the code of conduct so that you can begin to build some of that trust and more positive and more constructive culture within the organisation. There has clearly been in the past and currently some relationship issues between members and officers. As I said, partly that can be characterised by complaints being made against some officers. There is a protocol on member-officer relationships, and members and officers should ensure that they behave consistently with that. There is a particular important role in the organisation around those statutory officer roles, whether it's the monetary officer, the 151 officer, the head of paid service. There are also statutory roles in children's and adults as well. Those officers should be allowed to do their job and supported to do their job because they are independent of members, independent of the rest of officers across the organisation. And the advice they give should be listened to by members. And okay, comments previously that was the crux of this issue around the PIR, wasn't it? That the advice given by the statutory officer was not listened to by a member or different members. But officers need to be empowered to do that role effectively. Members should also be being role models for behaviour, but also calling out poor behaviour by their colleagues through the group process, through the whipping process, but also through other processes as well. Ideally, council should avoid complaints through the standards process because that means all other mechanisms has failed. Individual members have responsibility to behave in line with the code of conduct, and other people within their group and elsewhere should have some power and should feel empowered to call out some poor behaviour to prevent it taking root. We did think that members' training records should be published. That was a practical step, but I suppose that's an example of where the council decided to do something on the back of this public interest report, so change the code of conduct. They then put in place a whole set of arrangements to train members of code of conduct. We actually don't know who has attended that training and who hasn't. We suspect not 100% of members have attended that training. And if we can't find out ourselves and members can't turn up to mandatory training, then we think one easy solution would be to publish training records of members to see if they are going on those training courses. And then we've talked right at the bottom there at 4.6 of 3 steps to try and implement some of those recommendations above. The first thing is there does need to be more cross-party, cross-group working within the City Council. One obvious step would be to start preparing for the new council post-May May elections this year, to develop a programme of development and training for members, but that should be done really on a cross-party basis by the group leaders working together to try and work out what training needs to happen, almost to design that training in conjunction with your own member development officers and maybe some partners like ourselves or other people to help you deliver that training moving forward. Secondly, we think there are a whole set of improvement issues that the City Council face that have been ongoing for some time, as Mazars have said and as we have said in past reports. And we think the council should draw together an overall 3-year, maybe, improvement plan, not a long document, a very short document, talking about the change that people would like to see in terms of behaviours and culture within the council, and then making sure that improvement plan is kept to and delivered and achieves the results over the next 3 years. And finally, this was quite a narrow piece of work, looking at those 5 recommendations and the wider cultural comment by Mazars. We think the City Council should open itself up to a proper corporate peer challenge, maybe 4 to 6 months after the election, so probably in the late summer, early autumn, which would look at wider issues around reputation, performance, culture in the City Council at that stage, and also seeing whether there has been some progress around implementing these 5 recommendations and hopefully the development work that will be done post-election this year.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you and your colleagues for all the work you've done on all the reports that we've had. I'm certain there will be questions from members. I can see Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming along today to introduce this report, Mark. Much appreciated. At a council meeting last year, one of the political groups put forward a proposal to create a more cooperative council and asked for a working part group to be introduced, a cross-party working group to look at ways we can do that. Do you think that will be a way forward?
I suppose any conversation between different groups to work out how to make the council work more effectively or more cooperatively cannot be a bad thing, can it? But I guess I'm not quite sure what the members that were talking about that meant by cooperation. I guess to define what the nature of the situation is at the moment and where people want to get to would be the first step. And then I think talking together with other members alongside officer advice would be a way forward, yes.
Good, because it hasn't met yet, and I think it's something, sadly it's probably too late for this cycle, but I think it's something that's absolutely critical that it's got off the ground. Because one of the problems here is that unfortunately people tend to take the party political line far too much, and we don't work together for the residents of the city, and that is the biggest culture problem in this council. And I say that coming from a council where there was little political problems, little political debate. We made a decision, we argued it out, and when we did it, we got on with it. And that is what we have to learn to do here and not try to stall things.
Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mark. I think firstly, it's worth saying that, you know, you've been working with us for over a year now, and taking the different stages of the report as a whole, it's obvious the work that's gone into it. And I think it's really valued. And I think that the outcome here today is, whilst, if I'm honest, damning, it gives us all a very clear platform to build from. Following on from what Councillor Fisher has just said about a working party about cooperation that's been stalled. When the public interest report happens, there was a vote of confidence in Councillor Aspden's leadership following, as it's been highlighted by several members, there was a payment that exceeded contractual obligations and it was arguably unlawful. There was the PIR. There was a vote of confidence in Councillor Aspden's leadership. And he won that because of the backing of the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. Do you feel that has undermined the culture change since then? Because we've essentially got a council leader who was subject to PIR and all of the investigation, and then was seemingly got away with it because of party political backing. And I agree with Councillor Fisher that there does need to be some cross-party working here, and there wasn't at the time. So do you feel that, like, the fact that Councillor Aspden is still in charge is an issue that's holding things back?
It's a great question, and I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to answer the question. The thing I would say is that councils are democratic beasts, aren't they? Yeah.
Can I follow up with a second question then? That's on a different topic, if that's okay. But thank you for telling me it was a great question, even if you wouldn't answer it. Just above in the report, you've got on 3.11. Member and officers need to understand the roles of politicians and the roles of officers. Could you give us a bit more detail on that sentence? What really do we mean here? What is it that is currently not happening that needs to happen, or what have we not got right?
Well, I think in any authority, that's partly why you have induction processes, isn't it, for new members, is to get members to understand what their role is and what their role isn't as a member of a local authority, and also to get them to understand what the role of an officer is and isn't. And generally, it's members' responsibility to make decisions and to hold those people making decisions to account. It's officers' role to implement the decisions of councillors, but also to advise members about the legality, financial sustainability, etc., of their decisions. So I think it is generally, for instance, I've talked previously about the role of the monitoring officer in terms of advising member about the legality of decisions or processes. So I think that is one case where members need to understand what that statutory officer role is. You're presumably just getting round to agree your budget in the near future, and obviously the 151 officer will be producing a section 25 report before you make your decisions of budget. Again, that is a statutory role, so that members get the advice that they need from a statutory officer before they make a key decision like that. So it's that sort of thing, I think. But also at the same time, officers understanding that it is a member's right to make a decision if it's legal, and all those other things as well. And that members are the people that make those decisions through the scheme of delegation or the rules set within the Constitution. Yeah.
Follow up on that. Linking in something you mentioned earlier about, we have an executive structure, and in opposition, or well, any member really could call in an executive decision. There's been concern around previous monitoring of officers' involvement in the setup of call-ins, and the sort of being the gatekeeper almost of what can be called in and what can't be. Do you feel that we need greater clarification on that, or do you feel like we're missing something, or is that just how it should be and that's enough?
I mean, I don't know if Bryn wants to help me here in terms of what your constitution says, but I would have thought it's pretty clear in the constitution about how to arrive at a call-in and what constitutes a call-in or not. I know there's always a degree of subjectivity around some of these things, isn't there? But that is the person that has to give you that advice.
I think from a monitoring officer's perspective, I would look to intervene if what was being called in was potentially being called into the wrong committee, and that's fine, you bounce up to the right committee, or if it is outside of the scope of what can be called in, or if it's patently unlawful. Beyond that, I'm not there. Certainly, I don't consider my role to be to regulate what the committee decides and what the committee considers. I'm there to, it's a cliche, I'm there to find ways to say yes. So as I say, if it's going to the wrong committee, well, I might say you can't call it into, CCSSMC, but actually it goes to this one. That would be my approach.
It's quite refreshing. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe.
If I were genuinely an officer of this organisation or a member of this organisation,
Joe, can I just ask you to pull your microphone a bit closer?
Right. If I were a member of the organisation,
we've just got hissing radiators in the
or
background,
an officer of the organisation, I would be terribly upset with this. I'm an experienced public sector manager. This is grim. The history is awful. 2 public interest reports. Congratulations. That's close to unique. There've only been 3 in the relatively recent past. There were 3 years when there were none. The report before that was York. So that's me getting a bit of, on behalf of the community, whatever, a bit of fighting. You are a small number of the members of the council who have a specific responsibility around this table, and you can't take the guilt for everything that's happened in the past. And you're heading towards an election. And what I'm about to say is it's time to look forward, right? You've got an awful report. Miserable performance by the council, arguably miserable performance by some senior officers. And none of those senior officers are no longer with you. All of the councillors are. Come the revolution, come the next election, looking forward, you have a report. It's a remarkably polite report, if I may say so. It's written in a wonderful way. One of the members of the public was saying it wasn't strong enough. Actually, in bureaucrats' terms, it's an incredibly strong report that you've got in front of you about what's been happening here. So Mark's verbal presentation was a bit stronger. And actually, you should really make the whole council listen to a feedback report. But do not spend all your time looking backwards. There's a temptation coming up to an election to make political statements or statements that will have a political impact. The main issue in the report is about cultural worries. Where you are now, you're going to have an election, what's going to change about that? And there are a number of suggestions and proposals, which I'm sure you'll all sign up to, about 3-year plan to do this and so on. But what you need to have in there to get you beyond what is currently what I describe as a technical pass. It's not an F for fail, but it's certainly not an A or a B. You're somewhere between a C and a D. Personally, I'd put you near a D than C, because I don't know what the measurement is of where you're going. How are you going to measure progress? What is it? A 3-year plan without tests and measures gets you nowhere. If you look at other organizations, you'd be looking at things like doing checking what the staff think, checking what the members think, 360-degree. If you've worked in other organizations, you know about this stuff about trying to find out how the culture's going. If middle managers think that senior officers are not behaving properly, it would be as well that was clear. If senior officers think they're being bullied, who do they talk to? Does the monitoring officer actually have to take on the role of saying, you're upsetting me, you're upsetting him? How you get a control system in, I don't know, but you do need something to say over a 1-year period. We now believe from the reports we're getting back, relationships have improved or whatever, something's happening. So I suggest you need mechanisms, you need to make it happen. Senior officers need to feel secure when they're providing advice, that they're not going to be knocked around the houses. And at the same way, councillors need to make sure that managers are being monitored as to their performance, and they need a high level feedback that that's going on. A 3-year review is great, but where are your checkpoints going to be? What is your data which says, things couldn't really get much worse than they were, but they need to get a lot better than they are. You've been told that in a fairly gentle way. And I really could have waxed lyrical on the history, and I haven't, because it really is bad. But don't do it. Don't get into it. It's great. It can make you feel a lot better, but it won't help the organisation perform in the future.
Thank you, Joe. Any other questions for Mark? Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Thank you for this, and I'm subbing tonight. I'm not normally on here, but nevertheless, I have read it, gone through it. Given that we do have this political shift in York in terms of who is in charge or not, in ways that maybe other councils don't have quite so regularly, and we're looking to improve culture, would it not be best, do you think, in your opinion then, as we've heard some of the public speak and one in particular say, that we do include opposition involvement in a kind of cross-party way that Councillor Fisher talked about maybe, and that really whoever is in power to exclude anybody, any opposition from certain decision making? Would you think that that would be best served by more cross-party working? In a sense, I think you've answered that previously.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I'm not quite sure what that question was. That's why I said it wasn't quite clear what the cooperation or moving towards cooperation meant. And likewise, I'm not quite sure what your question is. If your question is, should you move to a committee system or not? I don't know if that's what you were actually angling.
I'm just saying major decision-making arrangements within the council would be best made if opposition were involved as well. And we've heard evidence tonight from the public speaker that possibly that isn't the case. And would you not think that any opportunity or every opportunity to involve cross-party working in decision-making would be better and would improve the culture?
I'm just going to come in there and explain that was in reference to the council's 10-year strategy. So, you know, obviously 10 years is beyond anybody's term of office that can be predicted. So I think, you know, that it's perfectly reasonable that something that is extending beyond the current administration's term of office would be cross-party and wasn't. I think what Councillor Fisher was referring to was a motion that went to council where moving to a committee system was absolutely the thing that needed to be explored and discussed. So I think there's probably two things here.
Okay, so there's a few things there. First of all, I mean, one of the things you do have in York, of course, is a cross-party executive. So you have more than one party in the executive for a start, which is quite interesting. So that does suggest there's some cross-party work, well, some good cross-party working within York, doesn't it? More generally, I think opposition members do have influence over the decisions that are made, even in a place like York, where you think it's just the executive making decision, because you just heard from Bryn, you know, that he will say yes to any sort of call in and the powers of scrutiny to look at various things. And there's no reason why overview and scrutiny committees cannot look at things before the executive make a decision on something. The executive publish a forward plan. There's nothing to stop scrutiny committees having a look at what's on the executive's forward plan and having a view on something before the executive gets to it on their forward plan. The really, really big decisions in York are already taken cross-party because they're taken by full council, aren't they? They're taken by full council on things like the budget. The budget is a full council decision. It's not an executive decision, and you'll be coming to that in a few weeks' time. So I think opposition groups already have the opportunity or the potential of involvement in decision-making in York. I guess it's whether they are taking up those opportunities or using that potential fully or not. On the more specific question, which I may have misunderstood Councillor Fisher's question about a committee structure or not, but if you were going to, anybody wants to know my view on that is I think the same answer I gave you last time, which is a red herring. It's a red herring. I don't think you should look at structural change to change the culture within the City of York. You should look at behavioural and cultural change to improve things in York. I think I also said last time that I can take you to councils that have a committee system that feel they're dysfunctional and have cultural issues. I can take you to councils that have a strong executive model like you do, where everything seems to be fine in terms of relationships between the groups and in terms of the controlling group. I think that is a red herring moving to a different governance system.
Thank you, Mark. Bryn wants to come in on this, and I've noted, Bob, that you want to speak next.
I suppose just to feed into that and that discussion about opposition members having influence, you're not a member of the leading group, as are many other committee chairs. From my perspective, that's unusual from what I've seen across different authorities, that it is generally the case that opposition members do not get chairs. Opposition members are not in those positions of control because the way that perceived democracy in local government has been is that if you are the largest group and you therefore control the council, you therefore control the committees, and therefore you put whoever you want in as chairs and control how it works. So York has a refreshingly different approach. I mean, I don't know whether this is something that Mark sees across the country, but certainly, you know, the approach of having non-majority members as committee chairs is quite unusual. And I think it's perhaps a starting point to build on.
Come back on that. I mean, that is a fair point, Bryn. Actually, that's one of the questions I often get asked. You know, should scrutiny be chaired by the opposition, or should scrutiny be chaired by the controlling group? Again, to some extent, I think that is a red herring, because scrutiny should not be political. should it? It should be looking at policy, performance and outcomes and things like that. But I guess it's a good point you've made that you do have opposition members chairing key committees like audit and governance. I think the key point that we wanted to make on this particular issue, where have I written it? Where have we written it? Sorry, 3.9, I think I talk about that, is that on the whole, there appears to be battle between members on what we called around process and around minutiae. You know, members seem to be obsessed with process and minutiae rather than the important issues such as outcomes for residents in the city. That's where we think the political debate and the political challenge should happen. Not around, as we've talked about it, personalities, process, minutiae, but rather on priorities, policies, performance and outcomes for the city and its people.
Thank you, Bob. Sorry, Councillor Webb.
It's all right, Katie. On minutiae, just one, 500 grand is not small, and that we cannot get away from it. That's the reason that we're here today. And I understand that there's lots, I know, but that's really important to make clear, because as we've heard from the public speakers, we've got kids starving in this city and 500 grand will go a long way. But anyway, that's not what I wanted to ask about. One question, I think, Joe, you're spot on that we need to move forward now. We need to really improve from here. And Bryn, I've been taking a look at the things that come out about member training and things like that. And I've got questions about it, but I think that there's some good stuff there. You know, it is refreshing to see that change. For me then, my question is, what training do you think is most essential first? You know, if you were a new councillor coming in, or, you know, again, we've been talking about experienced councillors that have fallen foul of issues here. A new member in May comes in. What do you think is the most important bit of training that they need to receive? And what, after that, are the biggest threats undermining change moving forward?
I mean, I think it would be good if the groups and the group leaders across York City Council could have that conversation rather than getting the information from me, not because I want to withhold it, but I think it's that you know your members, you know your City Council far better than I do. But I would have thought, as you get a new council elected in early May, I think it would be induction training for every single member, so they can understand the sorts of things I've talked about, you know, the roles of members, the roles of officers, what a good local authority needs in the form of members and members type of behaviour, what a good authority needs in terms of officers, the type of officers and officer behaviour, the relationship between officer and members, what makes for a good relationship, how to manage meetings, how to manage process, how to deal with scarcity of resources, scarcity of time and money, and how to focus in on the right priorities, something on those lines. Then I think there does need to be some more intensive training around code of conduct, I think, and that's not just, this element of the code of conduct says this, it's a conversation about, what do the Nolan principles mean? And, let's have a conversation around, does this mean I'm against the falling foul of the Nolan principles? Does this mean I'm falling foul of the code of conduct? I think those honest conversations between members, facilitated by group leaders, hopefully with some external help from maybe the LGA, maybe another organisation, with people like Bryn in the room as well. Just have an honest conversation about those things, so people feel confident that they can challenge and question, but on the right issues and in a constructive and a balanced way, rather than sort of anything that would sort of rebuild that trust that some of you have been talking about. And then I think there needs to be training for those people that take up new roles within the new council, whether they are chairs of committees like Ovian Scrutiny, whether it's scrutiny, more generally scrutiny members try and empower scrutiny to become more effective in looking at sort of policies, performance and outcomes for residents, whether it's portfolio holders, understanding what their portfolio means, because they are particularly responsible jobs, roles, aren't they? And then collectively teams like the executive to make sure they are functioning effectively as a team, and also functionally effectively as a team alongside and in a complementary way to the senior management team as well. So working through that. Yeah.
And my second part about the biggest threats.
The biggest threat, I guess, is York carry on as it has done for the last 10 plus years. And I think as we described it in 4.3, if the council is to draw a line under all this and to move forward, then that does mean that some members need to change their behaviour, and officers, all officers, need to carry out their roles effectively and be allowed to carry out their roles effectively. I think that's the key, isn't it?
Thank you. I'm just going to come in. I've got you listed, Councillor Fisher. I'm just going to come in with a supplementary to that. You've said a few times in presenting your report and in answer to questions about members needing to change their behaviour. And I suppose the question I've got is, how do we make sure that happens if we don't necessarily know about it? So I sit here as chair of Audit and Governance Committee, very concerned about governance and very concerned about how we make sure we do learn the lessons we need to learn and move forward. But that's quite tricky to do. So the question I've got is how can, and it might be that Bryn can help with this to some extent as well, is how do we make sure that we're working with group leaders, group whips to identify what issues there are within their groups that they need to address? I'm not suggesting for a minute that, you know, it's a kind of public sort of situation we're thinking about here, but how do we make sure that group leaders and group whips have whatever they need to address whatever issues exist within their groups? And because I don't think that at the moment many members would feel confident that having read this report, some of us will just magically know we need to change our behaviour and we'll get right on that. I'm going to do it by tomorrow, because I strongly suspect that the people whose behaviour is most problematic don't know it. And so how do we get to that point?
Well, I think that's probably our recommendation 8, isn't it? That the group leaders and the groups work together to try and design that sort of training so that you build that understanding and confidence around roles and behaviours and code of conduct. So that's the first step, I think. But more generally, I think there's a personal responsibility on each and every member to understand what good behaviour looks like, what their role is and what it isn't, code of conduct. And in fact, you sign on the dotted line when you get elected anyway, to that effect, don't you? So I think it's living that. Secondly, I think once you are all clearer about that, it's about that peer reinforcement. Yeah. So if you see a member or a colleague, a meeting colleague, behaving in a way that you do not think is consistent with the code of conduct, to call that out sometime. But you've talked about the whipping process. I would expect, you know, the whips to be more effective in holding their party members, their group members to account alongside the code of conduct. And I think in an organisation, in a council that is well functioning, it's not uncommon for a chief executive or a monetary officer to have a quiet conversation with a group leader or with a group whip, sometimes even, about a particular member, right, something that happened, and for the issue to be nipped in the bud and resolved quite quickly through that sort of process.
Thank you. Bryn.
Thank you, Chair. And just to sort of jump on the back of that, group leaders will be conscious, and group whips, that I have already put those sort of informal conversations in the diary with all of them, because that's what I want, is the ability to have that information flow, to provide group leaders and group whips with feedback about issues that I see before we end up in a standards hearing, because at that stage we've all failed. So that's part of my purpose, is to be there to provide that informal feedback, to allow the groups to deal with any members that they may have who need a quiet conversation that says, you might just want to knock that on the head. So.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Fisher next.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'm going to have to just make a comment about this persistent allegation that the £500,000 payment was illegal. It was 404,000, all but 63,000 of which were statutory pensions and other payments. The only dispute was over 63,000, which was to settle the industrial tribunal case. And that was paid on the advice of very, very eminent human resources lawyers. It was not just handed out. So
sorry, Councillor Fisher, there's no evidence in any of the information that has been made publicly available of any such legal advice. And in fact, the information from the independent external auditors completely belies that. So if you want to correct something, I am very, very happy for you to do that, but please correct it with factual and transparent information. Okay, but if you can't share that with me now, and if you can't share that with everyone, then it doesn't stand, does it?
All I can say is I have been advised of that, but I can't produce the evidence at hand.
Councillor Fisher, it's not worth the paper that it's not written on.
Right. Fair enough. I'll know more. Which is about a very important distinction between poor member behaviour and poor cultural behaviour. Because I sit on the Standards Committee, there have been a number of complaints made about members. I think two have been upheld and neither have had anything to do with this council itself. They were to do with behaviour in external areas. So I think we need to be very clear that there is no evidence that members are behaving badly in terms of not declaring interest or anything that could be classed as seriously. I'm sorry, you can look at it.
Sorry, Councillor Fisher, you appear to be trying to argue that there are no problems with councillors in this authority not declaring interest. There clearly are. We've had a public interest report on the back of our council leader not declaring an interest when he should have done. I'm not going to allow that to continue, because we're not going to twist the truth here. We shouldn't be dwelling on the past, but neither should we twist the truth and the facts. So if you want to move on, please make it factual and correct.
I will just say that the two standards complaints against the council leader on that matter were dismissed by the Standards Committee.
That's completely irrelevant.
It's not.
The external independent auditors have published their report, and their report questioned whether a declaration of interest was made because it should have been. Not because it shouldn't.
In his opinion.
But because it should.
In his opinion.
So I'm going to ask you to move on from that now, Councillor Fisher, because we're trying here to understand what lessons we all need to learn from this report.
And I'm moving on to that now. And
continuing to rewrite history is not learning lessons.
Right. The next thing I would bring up is the new training programme has been brought in. You say it should be mandatory. I totally agree with you. I went through the training programme when I came here. I'd been 23 years out of council, so I knew a fair bit about how councils worked, but a lot had changed. And I found the training programme I received inadequate, to put it mildly. Now we've drawn up a new training programme. How do we make it so that every councillor attends it? I mean, clearly putting it online is one thing, but how many people will see that? The main thing is that we have some sanction for councillors who don't attend the training. Do you know of any sanction that we do actually have? Because you're from the local governments. What can we do to ensure that all councillors attend their training and understand it so they're fit for the role?
I mean, on the specific training we were talking about in the report, which I think we've done at 2.6, we were talking about the mandatory training around the Constitution and the mandatory training around the Code of Conduct. And it wasn't our view, it wasn't us saying it should be mandatory, it was a council saying it should be mandatory. And I think we don't know the degree to which members have attended that. But what we have said at the back there is that 4.57 is that we think one way of dealing with that could be to make member training records a matter of public record and publish on the website. Whether that will solve the problem for you, if indeed there is a problem, I don't know. But we do know some other councils that do that, and that does seem to encourage members to turn up to training, particularly the stuff that is labelled as mandatory.
Thank you. If you say that's a satisfactory way of doing it, I'll happily suggest that we do that.
Well, we think that's a satisfactory recommendation at the moment, but as we said, it's really for the council to think about the improvements they're looking for and the outcomes, so I think it is almost as Joe was saying to you previously, work out what you want to achieve and then monitor progress against that. So if that action, that recommendation 7 doesn't do it for you, you may need to think about something else.
Thank you. Councillor Cuthbertson has waited very patiently, so go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Just referring to what is in this document rather than what isn't in it. I read into this that I think it's at 3.9 is one of them, but the business of embedded opinions and views is another one. And you talk about moving on. The report talks about moving on. I've got quite a lot of sympathy for that point of view. I think the question is, how do we change our thought processes? There are opinions and views in this council that have obviously been embedded for a long time. I think I'm the longest serving member on this council here tonight. And it's something I've seen since I was first elected in 2003. I can only say I think it's a shame. I think that people who take on a public responsibility and a public duty, and I'm not mentioning names, I'm simply saying that everybody who takes on public responsibility and a public duty ought to have that right at the front of their heads whenever they say anything, whenever they think anything, and whenever they hear anything. So for me, the issue with this is, how do we make that cultural change? You've mentioned one or two things. We can't, I think Bryn will confirm this, compel members to attend training. There's no sanction that can require that. But you could, in the culture of the organisation, as you've suggested, put up member training records, which would actually be quite a good thing. One of the ways in which I suspect it may be done is to have different groups, trainers, train other groups. I'm not saying that wouldn't be viewed with some cynicism at first, but it would encourage both the listeners and the speakers to think about what they're saying and what they're trying to achieve in such an event. So I'm asking you, Mark, if there are any any pills that can be given to this council to help encourage that change of entrenched opinion, which I think is probably one of the most damaging and corrosive features of this council. And I've worked in lots of organisations where lots of people have lots of different views, but the hard line entrenched, you are wrong before I even listen to a word you say, is really hard for me to take. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I mean, it's an interesting point about entrenched opinions and things like that. I think what we're really talking about here is entrenched behaviour, maybe, or similar or repeated patterns of behaviour and culture, which is the same sort of thing that Mazars talked about at 1.2, where we just lifted their comment about recurring themes of conflicts of interest and standards of member behaviour, things like that. So we're saying the same things, really, aren't we? These same sort of things are cropping up again. I guess you have got an election coming up, which in most councils does see some change of membership, doesn't it? And I suspect the same will be in the City of York Council elections this year. There will be some members that don't return. There'll be some new members, and that must give you the best chance in 4 years, anyway, mustn't it, of starting afresh. And I think we've then talked about sort of a programme of training and development in a cross-party way, ideally, or led by group leaders, to begin to change, because I think I share your underlying point, I think, which you need to draw a line under this and to move on and to do something different, because carrying on doing what you've been doing will just mean you go around this same circle again. So I think take the opportunity of a new council in May, get that induction training underway, get those cross-party conversations around code of conduct, behaviour, culture, things like that. And that will give you the best chance. And then, as I said, that's reinforcement from peers within the council, from the role of group leaders and whips and all that sort of stuff. use some political peers from outside the council if you want to as well. So as you know, we can supply and provide Liberal Democrat, Green, Labour, Conservative peers and independent peers from outside York to come and help you with some of that and to offer that sort of challenge and advice and support and training to try and get you to see how things work in other local authorities better.
It seems to me that actually probably having cross-group training is probably a bit of a difficult pill to swallow at this point, but you could put in there independent trainers, as you're hinting at, I think. And I think the last sentence of 3.9 is really what sums up why I have a lot of contempt for the embedded attitudes and behaviours that we've just been describing. Agreeing to disagree on some things, but in a constructive, cordial, respectful way. Pretty well sums it up for me. So I'd welcome a change to that. And thank you for your comments, Scott.
Thank you. Joe.
I think we have to keep an eye on what the outcome of this is going to be. What is the bit of paper going to say? So that's just a comment. We've covered a lot of territory. I still maintain that it's looking forward that's got to go rather than looking back. But I would make a couple of comments about relying on the groups to sort themselves out in the leadership. If the leader of the group is a problem, there's a problem. Generally speaking, senior politicians who've been around for a while often have absolute confidence in their own abilities. They wouldn't be there if they didn't. And it can be quite difficult within a group if you've got a couple of powerful, my history in other places, I'm not quoting York, but senior politicians who've got a grip on their party and therefore a grip on the organisation are a problem for the organisation and for their elected colleagues. So how you manage the internal processes within the group is not so straightforward as saying it's up to the leader, it's up to the whip. Because if those two buggers are working together, it's a problem for everybody. You know, so being realistic, I don't know who you will have after the elections in the leadership roles. And if some of those individuals have history and they've got history of problems, I really don't know how that's addressable by saying we're going to seek to improve everybody's behavior based on the leadership of the groups, because it may be that some of the leadership models are not going to be good models for you going forward. And one way of looking at it is to look at some worked examples. That's to say, look at some of the guys you've got at the moment, look at some of the things that they've done, you know, within your own group, say, and try to think through whether that was positive and whether it will be positive if they continue like that in future. It's awful difficult, folks, but really there has to be a fair bit of change, and you've got to sort it yourselves to a tremendous extent. You can bring in as many consultants as you want, you can do all sorts of other things, but if the heart isn't there, you know, it ain't going to happen. We haven't got a General Westmoreland in charge, you know, grab them by bits of their anatomy and their hearts will follow. It doesn't work like that. You've really got to work within your groups to convince yourselves you want to change your group behaviours, because the council members' behaviour that's been criticised is a sum of the council group's behaviours. Thus endeth the lesson.
Thank you. Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. I might not share some of the colourful language, Joe, but I share a lot of the sentiment there. I think that the bit for me is when we're looking at moving forward, and we do put together lots of training, and I would agree actually that I think it wouldn't be very difficult for the council to provide us with a training program which was online that would then just be published, and the members of the public could see what had been done and what hadn't been done. But would that change the culture? I go back to things I've said previously at this meeting. You know, we're talking about senior councillors who've been around for quite a while. And Councillor Cuthbertson, you said yourself that this is not a new problem, right? So we're talking about people who've been around for a while, and they still made mistakes. So moving forward, just having the procedures in place and the bits of paper in place are not necessarily going to make the difference. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this corporate peer challenge and what that would involve, and how that could maybe monitor the culture and the change in culture. What sort of measures would you put in place through that potentially to monitor change?
Okay, the first thing to say is we're not saying, as you can see from the recommendations, that training will solve everything. Yeah. Okay, but we're saying you've got a brand new set of members coming in May, so you may as well start as you need to go on with that group members. The recommendations refer to a whole set of different measures and activities, interventions we think should work. Because you're right, that's has been our question on this. Doing something like training members on the new constitution. The theory is that just changed everyone and they behave perfectly from now on. But we know that's not been the case. You think about the so what question on how to get the result that you want to get to. In terms of corporate peer challenge, councils are encouraged, enticed, persuaded, bullied sometimes by me, I have to say, to try and have a corporate peer challenge every 5 years, minimum of every 5 years. Every 4 years you are overdue in the City of York Council. It is a general health check of the local authority to think of how clear is the vision and the focus and the priorities of the City Council. What is the programme for financial sustainability? What is the culture, organisational capacity, etc., to manage the challenges as the city faces? And then the fourth area is around, the capacity to improve moving forward. It is an exercise undertaken by a collection of peers. So there would be a peer chief executive from another local authority, a peer leader or two from another local authority, depending on the politics. Post-election, we match up the politics to some extent, but we also have opposition members if that's wanted. Maybe another couple of senior officers from different local authorities elsewhere, away from the vicinity. By the way, it wouldn't be within Yorkshire and Humber, but it would be beyond Yorkshire and Humber. On areas that York are particularly interested in, is us offering that consultancy and that challenge on, whether it's economic development or community engagement or whatever, the particular, or financial sustainability, whatever it is, managed by one of my team. And it's really a holding up a mirror to the authority, talking to a range of people, holding up a mirror, triangulating the evidence, and then feeding back what we consider to be robust and strong messages to the authority about how its strengths, but also the areas it needs to consider to move forward. So part of that would be very much looking at the sort of the cultural questions that we have posed here, but there will be a whole set of other questions as well about financial sustainability, performance management, outcomes for the city and the economy. It's not, there's no cost attached to it as well, so it's not as if there's a reason to say no because there's a charge attached to it. And yeah, you should have one every 4 or 5 years. It's been a while since you've had one.
When was the last one?
2016.
I can't see anybody else wanting to ask a question, so I've got a few things that I've been making note of as the discussion has gone along, and some of the things I think are things I would like to hear from you, Bryn, on, in terms of we've heard a lot about we can potentially encourage members to attend their training by publishing training records. How do we make that happen? Who does it? Where should it sit? Who should be able to coordinate it and look at it? I've got more. The 3-year improvement plan around culture, again, how do we make that happen? Who should be involved in it? Where should it sit in terms of, you know, if we allow it to just be said and be in a report that we've all noted, then it disappears and nothing happens to it. And finally, the corporate peer challenge that Mark's just made a wonderful sales pitch for us to have. I'm totally persuaded, but again, how do we make sure that that doesn't get lost equally if for some reason, you know, the members that are around this table now, we may not be here on May the 5th. How do we make sure that that absolutely is something that the new council come May look at? Who should be looking at that, and where should it sit?
I'll try and remember those three. So in terms of the training, the way that we're intending on setting it up is through a system called Milo, which is what officer training is delivered through. That maintains an electronic record of attendance and completion. So I could go on now and show you the health and safety courses and various other bits that I do as part of my induction. So that system can produce a report which will list what the training is and which councillors have attended it. My logical extension to that would be then we attach that report onto a part of the council's website, probably the members section of the website. So when people are searching for councillors, there can be a sub page to that, which at the bottom, which will just say, if you wish to view councillor training records, click here, and it will just be a single page which will list all of the councillors and the courses they've done. That should not be a particularly difficult challenge technologically. My suggestion would be that we append that as part of the induction programme, and I'm happy to talk to Claire about how we make that leap, assuming that that's the decision of the committee, that the committee considers it's a good idea to publish those records. So your second question, please remind me.
It's the 3-year improvement plan around
improvement
culture.
Plan. Perhaps the right place for that to sit is audit and governance, on the basis that you are concerned with the governance of the authority. And therefore, whilst you may ask myself and the head of paid service and others to go away and think about what we might put into that, and that would then be, bounced not only around this committee but around the group leaders to design something that we thought worked. Actually, it's probably useful to get, whether it be quarterly or 6 monthly reports back here to say, what are we doing? How's it going? Do we see a difference? And that then gives this committee some remit to consider that and say, is it working? Do we need to tweak here or there or whatever? And then your final question is more of a challenge, because realistically, the decision to host a peer review from the LGA, and I will say I've been through several in my different parts of local government career. They're always fascinating and they are always enlightening about bits of your own culture you don't necessarily see. So from a personal perspective, I'm always welcoming of the LGA, because they bring an interesting perspective, and you get somebody from a different authority who comes in and sees things that you perhaps don't. I think in terms of how you secure that happening, that's probably a decision between the head of paid service and the leader of the council. Albeit there is obviously nothing to prevent this going to council as a motion, if that was felt helpful, because if council then has a full decision as a motion, it is something which then becomes actionable. To ask that the LGA be requested to attend, or it can simply be a correspondence from yourself to the head of paid service and the leader on behalf of the committee, asking that this be progressed at a convenient point in the future.
Thank you. Joe.
If I could just make a comment on one of Bryn's suggested way forward. You see about member reports and what they've done. In a way, I don't see why that doesn't come to audit and governance as well as a report. Actually, not so much of what they've done, is what they've not done. In other words, it's exception reporting of those bits of training which members haven't done, rather than a big lump of stuff on the website, which lists in a matrix everybody and every activity. Draw out from it the things which are the exception reporting and put it to a committee. And the word governance, the clues in the word governance, I think is we should look at it.
I'm happy to do that, Chair, but it would perhaps make sense to either do that sometime in mid to late June or July, on the basis that that gives time for the induction programme to run, and then we can come back.
As Joe spoke, I had an idea, which I'm now going to put to the committee. So it seems to me that quite a lot of the recommendations would essentially fit into a 3-year improvement plan, in terms of not wanting to lose sight of the recommendations that have been made and the things that we're trying to achieve through them. You suggested, Bryn, that should sit with audit and governance and be something that we would review periodically through the 3 years. And I think that, you know, that could include exception reporting on member training. It could include, you know, feedback gathered from member training, because I think that will be really important as well, to hear feedback from members that have been on training and have they found that useful. Are there things that they think are still a gap? And it could also include the question of the chair of audit and governance writing to the head of paid service and the leader of the council to encourage them to invite the LGA to do corporate peer challenge, and that can be put into the 3-year plan, which is then owned by audit and governance and will be reviewed through the year, so that you can do that at an appropriate point, because I think Mark was suggesting late summer, early autumn would be a good sort of space to start that process. I think that the starting point for the 3-year improvement plan is essentially to achieve these 10 recommendations, and to look after the various different activities that are going to be required of not only, you know, us in this committee, but also us as in the entire council, to do that, because I'm very keen that, you know, we need to not revisit the past quite so often, but we do need to not forget the things that we have at a moment where we felt very bad about stuff, said, yes, we must do something about that. And we can't lose that motivation. And some of us that were there and feeling bad at the time might not be there after May to hold on to that. So that is a recommendation that I think we should take forward. Bryn.
Can I add a thought into that, Chair? And I love it as an idea. In an ideal world, what you would do is you would do the induction training immediately after elections, and then each year you would do a refresher training. Now, some of that is down to members having time, and you know, we all have that sort of challenge. But would that be a useful thing to add into the 3-year plan? Is that we have refresher training each year?
Yes.
Which then allows everybody the opportunity to come back and test their knowledge.
Yes, because I think we did discuss that when we looked at the training plan at the last meeting, that people sometimes might prioritise one set of training over another because they know they're going to be on licensing committee and therefore they need to do that one. But they can't do 2 in that week. So they do the licensing one and they don't do the other one. But then in the second year of their term, they switch from licensing committee to planning committee.
Absolutely.
And they haven't done their planning training. Oops. So absolutely, we should have refreshers. Also, if you don't use something, you have a tendency to lose it from your brain. So, you know, if I do training on something in May, immediately after election, and then I have no need to use that information or the skills that I have gained for 2 years, well, I'm sorry, it's gone. So I think absolutely we should be retaining that as a annual program of training, some of it which will be just, you know, repeating things that we've done. Some of it might be new things because new things might happen. But yes, I absolutely agree. But the 3-year improvement plan to capture the things that are in this in this report, the recommendations, and looking at the exceptional reporting on any issues with training, I think is really important. Joe.
After a fair bit of self-flagellation of, councillors talking about what you've got to do to get it right, should there be anything in here in terms of governance, because that's what the rest of it is, about officer performance, senior officer performance, how they are changing in coping with this? I know there's a line management structure, and yeah, that's one set of things, but that's not quite what I'm talking about. I'm talking about any behavioural or relationship and performance changes which are impacting on the way the governance works. And God knows how you would do it. I don't know, but that's not quite the same thing as line management. The thing about relationship between officers and members is a two to tango kind of thing. So maybe just not relevant here, but I do slightly worry that some of the things being hinted at in there are officer-based weaknesses, which may not necessarily be strengthened by line management control changes.
Is that a supplementary to that? Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Webb.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at, Joe, but I think it's slightly uncomfortable for us as members to sort of potentially be encroaching on officers in that way. And actually, part of the reason we're here is because potentially that was part of the problem. So I think what we've talked about earlier about group leader, group whip, working with monitoring officer to raise concerns. And then maybe if there was a mechanism where the monitoring officer had to feed through to chair of audit and governance or something like that, if there was something clear that came up, and then that could potentially get fed up or fed out somewhere else, that might help. But
I'm just, the immediate thing that I thought was, should that be joint standards as opposed to it being joint standards, as opposed to audit and governance? But
I suppose it would, if it's about member conduct, then the natural place would be joint standards. If it's about a breakdown in member officer relations, that's more of a challenge anyway, simply because that's about management between the individuals. I've tended to try and interpose myself and try and sort of bring a degree of calm, but whether that's achievable is perhaps a different question. I'm not sure though where you would report that sort of challenge, because the fallout between the member and an officer means that essentially you've got a complete break in the working relationship. That's something that should be addressed on the officer side through officer line management and performance management. Through the member side, it becomes more challenging because it's not necessarily a breach of the code of conduct. It's just that you've fallen out with somebody. And please, if we ever get to the stage where falling out with somebody is a code of conduct matter, then we're all doomed. I'm happy to have a think about it and see if I can think of a way to make that work.
Councillor Fisher, did you want to come in on this? And then Councillor Cuthbertson.
I think you said most of what I wanted to say there, because clearly there has to be a clear protocol as to what members are responsible for and what officers are responsible for. And the two should never tread on each other's toes. Each should do the job separately and liaise to ensure that everything is being carried through. The problem is when members behave badly towards officers, criticise them in council, for example, or in a committee, which you should never, ever do, ever, under any circumstances, because the officers have absolutely no right to reply to those criticisms. It's then a question of how you deal with that. Standards won't always do that, because that has to be dealt with through the officer member protocol. And if an officer is feels under threat from the member, they may feel unwilling to actually take a complaint for fear it'll exacerbate the situation. The problem is, as you correctly say, it's how to deal with councillors who step over the mark and criticise, threaten, abuse officers. That's the problem.
Councillor Cuthbertson, did you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair. I was just thinking, every plan is only a plan. No, that I would need to start from that, really. But it just strikes me that whatever we agree this evening may be totally changed by different views emerging after May. What I would like to suggest is that whatever we produce this evening in the way of the recommendation you've just put forward is treated as effectively a draft recommendation to be confirmed, maybe even tweaked, modified slightly by our successors in the next municipal year.
Thank you, Councillor Cuthbertson. I think I wouldn't want to lose the opportunity to have the oversight of what is happening. I think if we go through the situation we've been through during our collective term of office, where we go through the PIR and then we have the intensive input that we have had in response to the PIR, and one of the recommendations from that is that we have a 3-year improvement plan around culture. Yes, some of the actions in that plan can be reviewed, absolutely, but I wouldn't want it to be a draft plan. I would want it to be a plan so that there is monitoring of what is happening, so that the Audit and Governance Committee, whoever is at the table at that committee after May, have the ownership of it, and so that it is not lost. So I wouldn't want it to be a draft plan. I would want it to be a plan. And I would want it to be something that absolutely, you know, the new Audit and Governance Committee could vote to end the plan and decide to throw it in the bin because they're just not, they don't believe it was required. But if we take seriously the need to improve the culture of the council, and you've been very helpful this evening on some of the history of that, then we have to do something about it, don't we? And I don't think we can just say leave it to whoever's here after May. We have to take the responsibility. It happened on our watch.
I was merely trying to introduce some element of, how can I put it, forward thinking and review at a future date, which is not actually, when I said effectively a draft plan, I wasn't suggesting, well, we're just going to take it to pieces now and throw it out of the window. I think this council's done that before in the past. I think I prefer to avoid that. And that was in that light that I was suggesting what I suggested. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Webb.
Yeah, I back you up there, Chair. I think there's been so much dithering and delaying over this. I mean, Councillor Cuthbertson, I was put on to Audit and Governance, and I'll be honest, I thought it was a bit of a sentence. But this committee has proved quite interesting, really, over the last 4 years, and tonight really does represent what, three or 4 years worth of backwards and forwards. And I think that it actually works really well if we can go away from here tonight with a plan moving forwards. And then, as Councillor Lomas says, whoever can then change things, that's the nature of politics, isn't it? But if we come away with nothing, then it's not good enough.
Councillor Cuthbertson.
May I respond to that? I mean, forgive me for saying this, but that's so reminiscent of the past. What I'm saying is, it's a framework, it's a draft, but it almost certainly will be amended by whoever takes over next year. And we hopefully the structure of this council won't change. I mean, the political structure won't change hugely. I'm not suggesting in terms of minorities, I'm talking in terms of multi-party representation, but there'll be 1 or 2 independents who will disappear. Things will change in one particular party. But my point is that actually we're dealing with a completely different set of materials. In fact, it may be somebody else dealing with a completely different set of materials and having to try to maintain what we've given them tonight. That's all.
Thank you, Councillor Cuthbertson. I mean, I can't see anything in here that I wouldn't anticipate anybody agreeing with. What we're talking about is a plan to strengthen trust and relationships between members and officers, a plan to ensure that members consistently act in line with the members' code of conduct, plan to ensure that members are given and hear advice they need, a plan to make sure that they role model good professional behaviour. we're not hearing anything here that's party political, or that I would expect any leadership of the council to want to change. You know, what we've been talking about, publishing member training records and how we might do that, and making sure that consideration is given to the corporate peer challenge with the LGA. We're not signing up to that. We're just saying it should be considered in late summer, autumn. I honestly do not see the worth of making a draft plan and it sitting undone between now and May. I think we should absolutely make a plan that would come to this committee to then agree and own and monitor, and at some future point in time this committee might decide the plan's no longer needed or it needs to change and change it. I've got Joe and then Councillor Fisher.
Chair, this may sound a bit facetious. It isn't really meant to be. It's the more of you who come back and sit around this table after May, the better. Continuity around an issue like this is helpful. So when you're given a choice to go on, whichever committee you're given a choice to go on, if you are given such a choice, it would be organisationally helpful if some of you stayed for at least another year to see it to a crossover phase. And if all of you who are re-elected come and sit around this table for at least 6 months or 9 months, even if you really don't want to do it again, it would really be very, very helpful for the organisation, for the cultural change.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, can I say that I didn't regard this as an onerous duty. I actually chose the Audit and Governance Committee because I'd seen what had been going on in previous administrations and wanted to try and do something about it if possible. And you're right, the actual culture of the council is not a new thing. It's not just happened on this watch, it's been going on for far too long. It's been going on, in fact, since 1995 when I first sat on this council. There was a very difficult culture of the council, and we need to find a way to get around it. And I've looked at these 10 points and I've put either agree, or vital, or work already in progress to every one of them. So I have no issue with any of the things on this recommendation. And I would move, we move forward with it. If whatever happens in May, if people then want to change it, twiddle with it, that's their concern. It's not ours. It may be the same group of people doing it. We've got the continuity, which, as I say, is absolutely critical. But yeah, move forward with it.
Thank you, Councillor Fisher. I think what I'm going to suggest then is that we in a moment, I will ask you to note the report formally, and then we will record an action for, I think it would be helpful if Bryn, myself and Councillor Fisher work up the recommendations into a plan with those few extra things that have been mentioned this evening, that we can bring back to the next meeting of this committee to agree, to make sure that it's been transparent and it's been agreed, and that will be a 3-year improvement plan in line with one of the recommendations that incorporates the other recommendations, and that also includes things like the publishing and the exceptions reporting on member training, feedback from member training, and developing the ongoing programme of member training, because I think that's helpful for that to sit with the committee so that we can continually look at that and look at what's required. Is that clear to everyone what I'm suggesting? Is everyone happy with that as our action to take away? Marvellous. And is everyone content then to note the report? Thank you very much, everybody. And there being no other business, our meeting is closed.